with mistakes made by Java programmers of all levels. So top 10 errors Java programmers make. So first is accessing a non-static member variable from a static method. Most of the times, like, we make this mistake. We try to access a non-static member variable from within a static method, like a main method. So when we do this, like, we get a compiler error. So see the following code, which is the wrong code. So the correct way is to see, now this is the correct code where we first get the instance of the class inside the main method, and then using the instance we access the non-static variable. So in order to access a non-static variable within a static method, we try to first create the instance of the class and then try to access the variable, which is the correct way. Now second is, second common mistake which normally we make is mistyping the name of the method when overriding. So while overriding, we sometimes mistype the name of the method, which creates entirely a new method. Even though the parameters, the name of the parameters and the return type remains the same, but if the method name is not the same, then overriding is not done and we get errors. So we have to ensure the name of the method remains the same during overriding. Third is comparison assignment. Like, sometimes instead of single equal to, we use double equal to. So we have to always understand, like, whenever we are comparing any two variables, like when to use single equal to and when to use double equal to. So whenever we are comparing two objects, like, sometimes we make mistakes. Instead of using double equal to, we use dot equals method. We have to understand that dot equals method only compares the contents of the two objects. Suppose we are using string comparison. So we can use dot equals method instead of double equal to. Because double equal to will compare both the content and the addresses. So whenever we are comparing two objects, we use double equal to, and whenever we are comparing two strings, we use dot equals. So this is the thumb rule. Now next is like confusion over passing by value and passing by reference. We always know that passing by value is when we pass a primitive data type. In that case, whenever we pass a primitive data type in a method, only the copy of the data type is passed. So inside the method, when we are trying to modify the value, the copy is only modified. The original value is restored. So we are only working with copies during pass by value. But pass by reference is also possible in Java when we are passing an array, a vector to a function. In that case, when we are changing in the object's member variables, the changes will be permanent because we are making changes in the references and not the duplicate copy. So we have to understand when we are using pass by reference and when we are using pass by value in Java. Sometimes we make the mistake of writing blank exception handlers. So we should always understand that it is a good practice to make a try and catch exception, because you never know, like, when your code, even if it looks like it's a good code, it's error free, you are using all the best practices, but it's a good practice to use try and catch, because whenever there will be an exception, you can always know the cause of the error. So sometimes the next error is, like, the next slide will go to. Sometimes we forget that Java is zero indexed. In C++, like, we don't have this problem, but in Java, like, everything starts from zero index. Whenever we are, like, declaring an array of string, see this slide. So it starts with the zero index. Because if you start with, say in the current example, string array equal to new string 3. If I try to do str array of 3, it will give array index out of bounds exception. So we have to always remember that it starts from 0 to n minus 1 if n is the length of the array. So we have to try to reduce these small common silly mistakes which we try to. Next is preventing concurrent access to shared variables by thread. So the best way to overcome this problem is to use the synchronizer accessor method. We always use getter and setter methods. So we see in the next slide, we are using getter and setter methods with the synchronized keyword. Thus, in this way, when multiple threads are trying to access the same variable, it may happen that one thread may modify that variable's value while other thread is trying to read it at the same time. This may lead to concurrency issues. So when you are trying to share a variable with multiple threads, then always make setter and getter methods as synchronized. Next is capitalization errors. So we have to always remember these few thumb rules, like all methods and member variables in Java API begin with lowercase letters. And all methods and member variables use capitalization. So suppose you have a variable called double value. So in the getter method, it will become get double value, where D is capital and V is capital. So this way you have to ensure that you are writing the getter and setter methods with proper variable names, proper capitalization. Next, one of the most common errors which every Java programmer makes is not catching the null pointers. So whenever we are trying to attempt to access an object and that reference is null, then a null pointer exception will be thrown. So the best way to avoid null pointer is whenever we are trying to access an object or a variable, first check if it is not null. Only when a reference or a variable is not null, try to access it or use it. In this way, and one more thing is that always try to declare and initialize a variable. If you declare and initialize an object or a variable in the beginning of the program, then the chances of getting null pointer error is minimized. We come to Java best practices now. We will see some of the bad practices in Java. Writing duplicate code is one of the bad practice. We sometimes copy paste similar set of code, that is writing same lines of code at multiple places in the same program. So instead of like duplicating the code, we can write it in a common method and call that method in other methods. Second is accessible field. It is a bad practice to use lot of accessible fields. So fields should always be private except for constants. And if you want to access a field, don't access it directly. Use the getter and setter methods. So always use the accessor method, that is the getter method, to access any field. Because directly accessing a field may lead to problems. Then using magic numbers. So we should try to avoid using magic numbers. Magic numbers are something like some hard-coded value. Instead, we can use, suppose we are using a value in a for loop. In the current example, if you see, instead of directly using the value, we can declare it as a final int constant and use the constant. So in this way, the chances of error is reduced and the code becomes more readable. So never directly try to use the constant. Instead, declare a constant as a variable, like final int x equal to say a number, instead of directly using the number in the for loop. Using temporary fields. We should try to avoid using temporary fields in a method. And if we need to access any temporary fields, we should try to like initialize it and hello? Yeah. Sorry for the delay. Like I think my slides were not moving. So we will continue from the start. Not a problem. We have just lost 10 minutes only. So I'll come again. Top 10 errors Java programmers make. The first is accessing non-static variables from a static method. As I told you that normally whenever we want to access a non-static variable from a static method like a main method, we should first try to, in the next slide you can see we try to create the instance of the class inside the main method and then try to use the non-static variable. So always try to first create the instance of the class inside the static method, and then using that instance you can access the non-static variables. So we should never try to directly access the non-static variable, otherwise it will give compiler problems. Second is mistyping the name of the method while overriding. So as I told you that normally while overriding, if I mistype the name of the method, it can create an entirely a new method, even though the parameter name and the return type remains the same. So we should be very cautious while we are overriding from a superclass in a child class. The name of the method should be the same. Third is comparison assignment. So sometimes instead of single equal to, we use double equal to, and which will give a compiler error. So in the comparison assignment, we should always use single equal to. So we'll move to next, comparing the two objects. So whenever we are trying to compare two object references, we should use double equal to. But whenever we are trying to compare two strings, which are not objects, like just two strings x and y, we can use dot equals method. So we have to make sure when to use double equal to and when to use dot equals. Though we will not get any compiler error if we use dot equals, I mean if we use double equals to instead of dot equals, but it's not a good practice in case of say string comparison, as you see in the slide. Next problem faced by Java programmer is confusion over passing by value and passing by reference. We should always note that in a function, whenever we are trying to pass a primitive data type like char, int and float, yeah, hello. Yeah. So whenever we are trying to pass the primitive data type such as a char, int, float, we are passing by value. In that case, within the function, if I change or modify that variable's value, I am only working on the copy of that. So the original value declared is still unchanged. In the next slide, we will see passing by reference. So whenever we are passing a Java object or an array reference in a function, in that case we are doing passing by reference. That is, if I try to modify the value of that array, then the original member variables get changed. Because here we are not working on a duplicate, we are working on the actual reference. Next problem is writing blank exception handlers. Sometimes we do try catch and we do not mention anything in the catch block. It's important to catch using a system.out.println e.get message, so that whether exception is thrown or not, it is a good practice never to write a blank catch. Forgetting that the Java is zero indexed. Unlike C++, in Java the arrays are zero indexed. Means the first element of the array starts from zero index. So sometimes even the seasoned programmers make this mistakes, like instead of accessing the array from 0, we try to access from say 1. So in the current example, if I try to do str array of 3, we will get an array out of index exception. So we should always try to access the array from 0 to length -1. Next is preventing concurrent access to shared variables by thread. So whenever you have an object or a variable which is being shared by multiple threads at the same time, you may get concurrency issues. To avoid this, the best way is, if you see in the slide, we synchronize the getter and the setter methods. So when the getter and the setter is synchronized, then the variable is controlled. So only one thread at a time can access or modify the value. So we will not get the concurrency issues. Capitalization errors. So in capitalization errors, we make this mistake, so we should always remember the rule that all the methods and the member variables in Java API begin with lowercase letters. And all methods and the member variables use capitalization. So suppose you have a variable defined as double value. So in the getter method it will become get double value, where D will be capital and V will be capital. So the first letter of the method name, so D, that is, it is capital. If you don't capitalize it, you will get the errors. We'll go to the next slide. Most of the Java programmers make this error of null pointer exceptions. To avoid this, whenever you are trying to access any variable or any object in Java, first always check if it is not null, if its value is not null, or if the object is not equal to null. Only when it is not null, try to access it or use it. In that case, you will never make the mistakes of null pointer. Another tip is, whenever you declare an array, whenever you declare any object or a variable in a Java program, always try to initialize it to null value or to its default value. When you do this, you will never get errors of null pointers, or at least you can reduce the same.